So this is something I've been promising for years now, and I'm finally delivering on it. I said I wouldn't do this, like I wouldn't do some other things until I had a really good idea of what I wanted to talk about. And I might redo this at some point. I might make additional reaction reviews because this one's not really going to deal with religious themes. This one's going to deal with psychological and I guess you could say secular philosophical themes. So, just for those of you, maybe let's just take a step back and I'll talk about my relationship with Evangelion. So when I was young and I started, I used to every night, every Friday night on YTV, they would stream Inuyasha, Gundam Wing, and there's a couple other animes they would stream. And I was really getting into it. I liked it a lot more than most Western cartoons because it was a lot more mature and a lot more kind of deep and just had more kind of adult storylines. And a friend of mine is like, well, Argent, there's this thing they talk about in Japan. It's supposed to be super messed up. It's the highest rated anime like of all time. And it's just this bizarre series called Evangelion. And there's an old website called Animetric that I think's still around, and they had like a review of Evangelion, and I was reading about it there, and I was like, this sounds awesome. It sounds completely crazy, but it sounds like all the kinds of stuff I like. You got mechs, you got cute girls, you got a really deep storyline, you got all this Christian symbolism, and I was dead set. I had to watch it. So I wound up. This was back when I was still using Kazaa. Anyone remember Kazaa? No, good. It was full of viruses and shit. But I downloaded Evangelion off of Kazaa, and it was like 1 to 5 kilobytes a second. So it took me like 3 weeks to download it. I got the subbed version, and I had to watch the subbed version on my old crappy PC with Real Player. Anyone remember Real Player? No, that's a good thing. Real Player's shit. But yeah, so I watched it on that, and it was just fucked up. The speed just went, I think it went at like 1.4 times speed, and it stuttered a bunch. But I watched it. I watched all 26 episodes, and it was like the most amazing thing I'd ever seen. And I was just like, this is incredible. It's weird, yes, but it really speaks to people, especially people with mental illnesses, on a very deep and profound level. And I think Evangelion, regardless of what you think about it, and there's a lot to criticize about it, especially with the rebuild, and there's a lot of bad shit you can say about it. I won't defend a lot of it, but it is the best portrayal, I think, and the most kind of empathetic or accurate portrayal of mental illness I've ever seen in pretty much anything. I think it really grasps what it's like to be depressed, what it's like to be alienated, what it's like to just kind of be alone in society. So that's it. Really, I watched it when I was 12, and I watched it a number of times because, as I think I've described, I suffer from severe depression, and I was suicidal even as when I was very young. The oldest time I can remember being suicidal was when I was 7, and 7 was my favorite number, and I wanted to kill myself before my 8th birthday so I could stay 7 forever. That's how messed up I was as a kid. It's not because I have great parents. It's not because of that. It's just I had childhood bipolar that was undiagnosed and untreated. So I watched that. Eventually, one year, my mother got me Death and Rebirth and End to Evangelion for my birthday, and when this was during a time period where I was just so depressed, and I watched End to Evangelion I think 25 or 26 times. Like, I'd watch it like once a week or several times on a weekend, just because I was so depressed, and it just kind of spoke to me. And this was a time period when I was engaging in self-harm and stuff, and it's just always been very near and dear to me because it's kind of something that's always kind of been there. And there's always more analysis of it. There's always more fanfics. It's always just kind of a constant in my life. I know that's weird to say about an anime, but yeah. So the ramble's over. Let's get to an analysis. Let's get to what makes this such a great series. Now, I think what it boils down to is the two major themes in Evangelion are identity and purpose. And generally speaking, you can analyze each individual character with regards to how they approach the theme of identity and the theme of purpose. Now, let's just define our terms for a bit. What does identity mean? Identity is how you define oneself. And that's a bit more difficult than how people might imagine on the surface. Because you can define yourself by your name and say, I have this permanent, unchanging essence that is the I am. And that's true, but that doesn't necessarily tell you much. Are you a good person? Are you a bad person? Are you cowardly? Are you strong? Are you weak? You have all these other traits, and how do you decide? How can you tell if you possess them? How can you tell if you lack them? How can you tell if you're a good person? How can you tell you're a bad person? How you have to do it is you have to compare yourself to others. You have to try to internalize the standards of your society. You have to try to understand what other people are saying about you, and just from that try to build a perception of yourself. And that's kind of one of the ongoing themes in Evangelion, is the inability of most of the characters to build a perception of themselves, at least a perception of themselves that's independent from external validation, is what causes so much of their pain. The issue isn't so much that they reach out to others, it's that they reach out to others in a very bad, dependent way. None of the characters well, maybe one or two, and we'll get to that in a second. Very few of the characters have a defined sense of self. They can't really define themselves in terms of who or what they are. They can define themselves in terms of how they relate to other people, specifically with regards to what other people think of them. I think probably one of the best examples of this is in the original ending, when everyone was undergoing their psychoanalysis. Shinji was like sitting there, and then Asuka came up to him and she's like, I'm the Asuka that exists in your mind. So I am your perception of what Asuka is like. I'm not the real one, but I'm how you're, the Asuka he saw was how he perceives her. And it's the identity that he projects onto her. And most of the characters in Eva lack a really strong core identity, so all they really have is external validation. And I think that's where a lot of their suffering comes from. So let's just kind of start to go through the various characters, their lack of identity, and how it leads them to kind of their issues. Now, let's start out with Gendo Ikari, because he's a very kind of straightforward example of this. Gendo's initial kind of state, for those of you who don't know, I'm going to be going through a lot of history in this, was he was born to an abusive father. He got into a lot of fights. He may have been involved in some criminal activity. He was known as kind of a ne'er-do-well. He was regarded very, very poorly. And eventually he came across Yui, and Yui Ikari was the first person to see something in him that other people didn't. She said, you're a good man, Gendo. You're an intelligent man, and you can do better. And I love you. And this external love, this external validation, gave Gendo an identity. He was able to internalize this identity from his wife that replaced what he had kind of internalized from the way other people attacked him. And kind of, I think Gendo's one of his biggest downfalls is that he doesn't have a strong, independent sense of identity. Once Yui kind of vanished, there was nothing left for him to do. He couldn't take his role as kind of the defender of humanity as his identity. He couldn't take the role of father as his identity. He's incapable of having an identity outside of what Yui enforces on him. So his entire goal through the series is just to get Yui back so she can validate him, so that she can give him an existence, more or less. And ultimately, he's an extremely cold and empty man. And he is aware of this. In End to Evangelion, when everyone's being taken up into the LCL, when they're all becoming one, rather than being met by Yui, Unit 1 appears and bites his head off. Now, a lot of people like to think that this means he wasn't taken up. I think it's just because everyone was taken up and kind of got what they believed they deserved. I think he was taken up into instrumentality. It was a manifestation of his guilty conscience and his inability to properly relate to his son. So there's that. Let's talk about Misato next, because she's kind of another fairly straightforward example. Misato lacks all real sense of self. It's kind of hard to describe her core personality. Her entirety of her life is basically revolves around the identity she takes with relation to her father. She hates her father, but she also loves him. And so she's made her life's work attempting to avenge her father by killing the angels. Does she actually want to kill them herself? Not really. She's not particularly interested in being the defender of humanity, of any kind of greater cause. All she's really doing is opposing the angels because it gives her a purpose in life. Prior to that, for a long amount of time, she was completely silent and completely catatonic. For a time, her identity was kind of based around loving Kaji. But I think part of the reason she left him is her fear of kind of developing a strong independent identity. And she didn't want that. She was so used to just being in relation with her father that she couldn't deal with it. So Misato's personality is extremely erratic. She spends most of her time drinking and working to attempt to forget and to try to fill the hole in her basic lack of persona. And she basically, I think, uses her father's, getting revenge of her father to avoid kind of dealing with the emptiness within her. So we have her. Ritsuko is pretty straightforward. She doesn't really have a core identity. She's just basically copying her mother and living out her mother's dream because she doesn't have a defined self. She just has an imitation of her mother's. So she's Gendo's lover like her mother. She works on the Magi like her mother. She resembles her mother in every way she can. And she never kind of developed a sense of self apart from her mother. And I think you should be kind of seeing where this is going. We have all these people who, if you ask them who you are or to describe themselves, they wouldn't really be able to assign traits to themselves. They would say, like, Gendo would say, I was loved by Yui. Ritsuko would say that I am my mother's daughter, I'm a scientist. And Masato would say, I am an avenger. So you have all these people who don't have anything aside from what someone has imposed upon them or what they've kind of taken into themselves. Now, Asuka's probably the most extreme example because her identity was explicitly taken away from her. As those of you who have seen the show will remember, her mother's soul and most of her consciousness was sucked out of her and into Unit 2. Since her soul's in Unit 2, her body just was kind of a husk and went crazy. The mother refused to acknowledge Asuka and called her that girl over there, and instead she showered her affection on a doll. This destroyed Asuka's identity because she didn't have a parent who was there to help her grow. She received no nurturing. Instead, what she wound up doing was just trying to imitate adults. Asuka isn't mature, she just kind of acts like a person. She kind of wears a person suit, but because she never received proper emotional development, deep down, all she really is just trying to imitate people. And trying to imitate what she thinks is socially acceptable and imitate what she thinks is what other people want her to do. So she'll often talk about, I refuse to cry, I have to be a good girl, I have to be strong, I have to be perfect. Because she doesn't have emotional maturity, she can't accept failure at any costs. She needs people to validate her. She needs people to impose some semblance of identity on her, and that's why she's so obsessed with piloting Eva. Because it's something that only she and like 2 other people can do. And it's a unique talent. And she's praised for it, she's spoiled because of it. And it allows her to fill the void that was came from not having her mother acknowledge her or her father acknowledge her. So, yeah, so that's I think kind of how to describe Asuka. I think one of the things that she loves and hates about Shinji is she views Shinji as another form of identity. If Shinji can love her or have a relationship with her, then she'll have another form of validation outside of just having Eva. She'll be able to maybe, together through kind of mutual affection and growing up, they can kind of develop a core identity. So Asuka is a completely empty person. There's nothing inside of her. All that's inside of her is pain, and everything she basically does is a person suit that she puts on to try to imitate what she thinks the outside world will be. And that's why she's often very stilted. She's often very strange in the way she acts. She's often very two-faced. I don't think it's necessarily malice on her part. I think it's because she's attempting to imitate what she sees the outside world as. So then we get to the topic of Shinji. Now Shinji's interesting because I actually think he does have a stronger core identity than most of the people in the series. The fact that he was the last operational pilot and one of the few characters who is still functioning by episode 24, I think says something. I think as opposed to Asuka, Shinji does have a great natural compassion. He has a great deal of natural talent. He does have core values. He's just too scared and too nervous to really acknowledge them, to nurture them, and to let them flourish. In contrast to most of the other characters, he came to the show kind of having an identity. Granted, he viewed himself as being weak and cowardly, but there still was kind of a discernible self to him. So I think despite his depression, despite his avoidant personality disorder, he is much more emotionally stable than most of the remainder of the cast. So yeah, so Shinji, even so though, he has the same need for external forces to impose a sense of self on him. If you look at it, a great deal of the show is him trying to get the affection of his father, trying to get his father to acknowledge him as his son. And whenever he's asked why he pilots Eva, he just says, because other people told me to do it. Shinji lacks the will to kind of assert a personal identity. I think he does have one. I think it's fairly strong. I just think he lacks the courage to really assert it. As I've said before, Shinji is the Messiah. He just lacks the confidence to really to fully live up to that role. But the fact that at both endings, he's willing to reject perfection in kind of pursuit of an imperfect world, I think says a lot about his character, and I think it says a lot about who he is as a person. I don't think Asuka or Misato or any of the others would have rejected it in that fashion. So finally we come to Rei. Now Rei's another case of someone who has completely no self whatsoever. She was literally born as being a blank slate. The only thing that she has is piloting Eva and fulfilling the wishes of her creator Gendo. That's her only purpose in living. And what kind of happens to her is when Shinji starts to be kind to her, when she starts to kind of develop relationships with others, her inner self begins to expand. The person known as Rei starts to become more of a full person. Granted, the extension of her persona is only really defined by her relationship with Shinji, but she gradually, as the series goes on, becomes more and more of a full person until she eventually dies and is replaced by Rei 3, who is just completely empty. So in contrast to that, we have, and this will be a transition to part 2 where we talk about the sense of purpose. We have a couple characters in the series who are fairly content and are fairly happy. The most notable example of this is, of course, Kaji. In the anime, at least, in contrast to every other character, Kaji seems to be fairly happy and content with who he is. He seems to have a very defined sense of who he is, what he's like. He doesn't mind his life situation as much. He always finds something to joke and smile about. Kaji is, generally speaking, a very, I guess, kind of full and well-rounded person. And if you listen to him talk, he's just a lot more aware of what he is. Like, he talks about, all I want to know is the truth. I'm obsessed with finding the truth and investigating. And they even tell him, Kaji, this is going to lead to your termination. This is going to lead to your death. And he just basically says, I have to find out the truth about this. It doesn't really matter to me whether or not I die. I have to be true to who I am. And even when someone comes to kill him, he doesn't really seem to care very much, because he lived his life in line with who he is. He knows he loves Misato. He doesn't try to beat around the bush. He doesn't try to run away from it. He just accepts it, and he loves her unconditionally. He's able to kind of be a father-like figure to the other cast just because he is the most mature. He is probably the strongest single person in terms of character in the series, although he doesn't have a lot of time to really explore it. But let's shift to part 2, which is kind of an extension of identity, which is purpose. Now, people need a purpose. People need to find meaning in their lives. They need a narrative, if they will, to remain sane. And one of the main things in Evangelion is the struggle of the cast to find a purpose in life. To find a purpose to keep struggling, to find a purpose to keep living. And when they have that, they're strong and happy. And when they lack purpose is ultimately, I think, what kills them. Like with regards to Asuka, when she loses her ability to pilot her Eva, she no longer has a purpose. As we said about when we're talking about her identity, she has no other form of validation. She doesn't have Shinji's love. Kaji doesn't care about her. Misato's a drunk. She has nothing in her life outside of Eva. And when it vanishes, her entire purpose for living is basically gone. And she attempts to kill herself because there's nothing more to keep her going. Shinji, likewise, briefly at certain points in the series, gets a purpose. He decides, I forget when it was like a man's fight or something, when he's facing off against Leliel, and he briefly kind of gets his confidence and decides that he's going to be the protector of humanity. Although that doesn't really work out, and he decides that he's going to be the protector of Rei, and kind of his purpose keeps being stripped away from him. But ultimately, he, I think, does have a natural sense of compassion, a natural sense that humanity needs to continue on, which is why, as I like to point out, he keeps fighting until the end. And going to Asuka, in N2 Evangelion, I think she finally realizes that despite her flaws, despite her kind of lack of character, she is still loved, and she is still worthy of life. So you kind of have that scene where she is about to die from the depth charges, and then she just goes all out and just starts kicking everyone's ass, and she's finally happy and joyful because she realizes that her mother's there. And part of that is she realizes that the stuff her mother did in real life wasn't actually her mother. It was kind of a shell lacking a soul that was doing that. But she finally realizes that she has a desire to live, that she doesn't want to die after all. And with that purpose brings immense strength and brief happiness before she gets killed. But that's for another time. Gendo's purpose is to see his wife again, but at the same time, it's kind of difficult. I think kind of the counter message to a lot of the attempts of people to build artificial purposes for themselves, like to make a world free of suffering, to kind of remove oneself from the world, to become completely independent, is the idea that human beings are naturally social creatures and human beings have to live in the real world. This is stated a couple times in the series. Like when Rei makes tea and Shinji and her drink it, she goes, "It's bitter." Shinji says it's bitter, and Rei says, "Yes, but it's warm." And that's, I think, kind of supposed to define life. Life is warm, it's something good, but it's often very bitter and painful and difficult to endure. We also have the scene where they're in Alaska, and Gendo talks about how the Dead Sea was formed as a result of mankind's sins, and that they have to be washed away. And Fuyusuki says, "I'd rather live in the real world regardless of how contaminated by sin it is." So it's an acceptance that humanity has to struggle, that despite all our sins, despite all the bad stuff we do, that there is purpose to our suffering, that there is hope for the future. And that's kind of a core aspect of depression, is it makes your time preference go way up. It makes you unable to see the future. It puts everything in the direct here and now, and it not only puts everything in the here and now, but it makes it extremely painful. And that's kind of what both endings of Evangelion, I think, are really about. It's about Shinji and the other characters kind of coming to terms with the idea that human life is a purpose in and of itself. The continual existence of man, the continual existence of life, is enough to justify our existence. And this is, I think, very noticeably talked about by Kwaru. When we first see Kwaru, he talks about he's humming Ode to Joy, and he refers to it as the highest achievement of the Lilin or human culture. So Kwaru basically comes to the conclusion that humanity deserves to exist, that humanity is a purpose in and of itself, and it is an end as well as a means, and that it's something that has to endure. And he kind of realizes his purpose, and this depends whether or not you think Kwaru is a villain, but that's neither here nor there. But his purpose is to sacrifice himself to allow the greater purpose to continue, to allow mankind to continue to evolve, to change, to create music like Ode to Joy. He kind of finds that life has inherent value. Now, because I'm not talking about religious themes, I think I should just briefly add that kind of in Christian thought, life has meaning because God loves you. The fact that he loves us is enough to justify our existence. And kind of the ultimate purpose of humanity is just something that's talked about a lot. And I think that's kind of ultimately the reason that Shinji and everyone else rejects instrumentality or completion, because humanity can never be completed. We have infinite potential and we have an infinite future before us. And if we could be completed, it won't be through the actions of man. It'll be through the actions of God in some future world. So I think what kind of Shinji realizes is that he has purpose. Despite his depression, despite his failings, despite his difficulties in his life does have meaning, it does have value. And in the original ending, he eventually acknowledges this. And he's like, so I'm not cowardly, sneaky, and weak? And they're like, no, that's something you've imposed on yourself. You have value. People care about you. You can continue existing in the real world. You don't have to keep hiding from it. You don't have to keep running away from it. It's difficult. It's bitter but warm. But you do have purpose. And whenever the characters are happy in Evangelion, it's because they found identity and they found purpose. It's how Kwaru is able to die with a smile on his face, because he knows who he is, and he knows that he's fulfilling a greater purpose. And I think it kind of relates back to Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. And I think that's ultimately, to me, what Evangelion's about. It's about people trying to define their identity, and just to say, is my identity based on what other people say? Is my identity based on who I am? Is my identity based on an external or internal factor? And I think if you look at that and you kind of try to look at the struggle for it and the way that characters try to find meaning and purpose, it's I think that's the core of this series, and I think that's why it fascinates people so much. Is how much something kind of as basic as defining oneself and how one relates to others and to society is the root of most mental illness problems and the root of most of human suffering and pathos. And the attempt to try to kind of get rid of it was to end the distinctions between people. But in a sense, all that does is it nukes the problem. It gets rid of problems of purpose and identity by just casting them aside altogether into the abyss. So I hope you enjoyed it, my reaction review. I hope that made sense. I'll probably do another one at some point talking a bit more about the religious issues. But yeah, God bless you and enjoy the review.